Miss Bennet.
Mr. Darcy?
Please allow me to apologise for not perceiving it properly.
He is all ease and friendliness. I'm as astonished as you are.
Come, man, admit it. She's an angel.
I would be very happy if you would dance with me, Miss Bennet.
I do like him very much.
Some stories transcend time. They endure, not because of the era in which they were written or told, but because they speak to something deeply human. Love, longing, pride, and of course, prejudice. From Jane Austen's Victorian English drawing rooms to today's digital screens, the essence of storytelling remains unchanged. The power to transport, to transform, and to connect. But what is the art of timeless storytelling? What makes a narrative endure, and why certain tales still resonate centuries later? Today, we unravel the magic behind the stories that refuse to fade, from classic literature to modern media, marketing, technology, and beyond. Welcome to Season 9 of The Great Indoors, where we explore the transformative role of storytelling in an era of generative AI. As technology shapes our culture and products, the risk of homogeneity looms large. This season will discuss how embracing unique narratives can counterbalance AI's influence, ensuring our stories retain depth, authenticity, and originality. Join us as we champion the human voice in the digital age. I'm your host, Matthew Roberts, and as ever, I'm joined by the one and only Supremo podcast producer, Larissa Yee. So today, as part of this incredible season 9 of episodes, we're diving into the art of storytelling with someone who knows it inside and out, Miss Poppy Hollingworth. Now, Poppy is a writer, storyteller, marketing expert with a deep love for crafting narratives that resonate. She holds a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Warwick in England, and an MA in Creative and Life Writing from Goldsmiths, University of London. With a background spanning copywriting, marketing, and creative storytelling, she has spent her career shaping messages that connect with audiences. In this episode, we explore the 7 universal story types, how storytelling shapes business and marketing, and why Dickens and TikTok storytelling isn't as different as you might think. Plus, Poppy shares some deeply personal stories from her childhood that transformed her view on storytelling forever. So whether you're a Jane Austen fan, a sci-fi junkie, or someone who appreciates a well-told tale, this conversation is for you. So let's go. Okay, so welcome back to The Great Indoors. We have another spectacular episode for you today, really interesting episode. And I'd like to introduce our guest to today's show. Her name is Poppy Hollingworth. Poppy, welcome to The Great Indoors.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here.
Yeah, great. Thank you for joining us. We are recording this early on a Sunday morning, which is nice. And for our listeners, Poppy, give a quick introduction of yourself, your background, your history, if you could.
Yep. So my name is Poppy Hollingworth, and I have grown up predominantly in the US, but with a UK family. So I've had a lot of kind of back and forth there. But I've also always had like a really solid background in creative writing, which is kind of what we're here to talk about today. I was always interested in it growing up, and then went to university and have a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Warwick, and an MA in Creative and Life Writing from Goldsmiths, University of London, and have been fortunate enough to follow that kind of through with my career doing marketing copywriting. So not really the same, but still being able to have some element of writing in my day-to-day.
Awesome. And I know when we were getting ready for this and we were catching up, I think it was your prowess in the creative writing process and storytelling that we were interested in tapping into, Poppy. So let's get into it. We've discussed this whole season today and we've heard individual stories from our guests. But from your experience and education, what makes a great story? What are the elements that need to be incorporated in order for something to be considered a great story?
Well, for something to be a good story, primarily it needs to start well. And it's quite well known that when starting something like a book or a TV show, you have to start with change. You can't just go into someone's life and see it as a day-to-day. Typically, there are things such as, is someone leaving? Is someone arriving? Has someone died? Like, that is what starts a story. Another thing that creates a really good story, in my opinion, is conflict. You need there to be drama, you need there to be back and forth. And from the conflict, there also needs to be change. The people at the beginning of a story and the people at the end of the story cannot be the same person at their core. And in a way, that can also be the reader or the listener. A really good story is one that ends and you feel as though you, as an audience member, have changed in some way as well.
And has that always been the case? I mean, have those elements universal from the origins of storytelling?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, looking back, let's take Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. That starts with the arrival of a new family into this village, and that's thrown the entire village into disarray. These are new prospective husbands for their daughters. These are new social circles to encompass. And you see and again, you see that character change throughout the novel as well with the character of Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet. And there is conflict and there is development. And you see that. So you see that with Jane Austen, you see that with Shakespeare. The Tempest starts with a huge storm. Twelfth Night starts with a huge storm. It starts with a separation. You always need, the story comes from a change. A story is it's a combination of what happens after and what's going to happen next.
And you've just triggered a thought in my head. I'm going to save it for later to how we apply that in business and technology. But the change for sure is the spark, right? Is the genesis in that new story. That's cool. Actually, I was speaking to my mother yesterday because it was Saturday. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm watching Sense and Sensibility, the Jane Austen. And she said, and there's a new Jane Austen show about to start on BBC, a history of her life or something. And I said, we'll be discussing that tomorrow. Anyway, there we go, just a side note. So anyway, we talked about what creates and what's needed to begin a good story. But the other thing is the categorization of stories. And I think this is really interesting, Poppy. Give us a rundown on the different categories of storytelling, because there's only a finite number of categories, right? That you can pretty much attach any story in literature, movie, business, back to one of these categories. So give us, our listeners, a rundown on that different categorization.
Yeah, exactly. So as you said, all stories and narratives more or less fall into about 7 narrative structures. And those are Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. And it is really interesting because when you overlay those narrative structures onto a series of films or books or stories, a lot of films are almost the same story, but just with different characters and slightly different jokes or taglines.
Yeah. Now, I didn't catch all 7, but Overcoming the Monster. Give me an example.
So a really good example of that would be Coraline by Neil Gaiman. I don't know if you've read or watched it, but I mean, that's it. And that's quite an obvious one as well, because I can't quite remember off the top of my head what the evil mother is called. But the whole point of Coraline is to save her parents and defeat this monstrous being. And I actually watched and this ties back into as well what makes a good story. I watched a really interesting interview with Neil Gaiman about Coraline. And he said that what he wanted the biggest takeaway from this book to be is how to be brave. And that comes from overcoming the monster. And being brave is not the same as not being scared. He said being brave, being scared, and doing it anyway. And that is because it's a terrifying children's story. But that is the message he wanted to give with it. And if Coraline can defeat this monster, why can't you?
So And I'm going to be doing this for the whole interview, Poppy. When I take one of those categories, I automatically think of a story that I can insert into that category. So when you just defined overcoming the monster, the first thing that popped into, and you said you have to be brave, overcome adversity. Star Wars, for example, is overcoming the monster, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And what was this is great. I love this. What's the second one in your list of 7 there? What was it again?
That was riches.
Rags to riches. So that's the Cinderella. So I think we can think of a number of those. What was the third one?
Third one was The Quest.
The Quest. So an example of the Quest would be Lord of the Rings.
The Odyssey is one people always typically go for, but it's with one solid goal in mind and the adventures our character meets on the way to this quest.
Okay, so that's 3. Fourth one was?
Voyage and Return. So that one is typically, so I think quite a good one for that is Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy goes to Oz and she comes back to Kansas and nothing's changed, but Dorothy has changed on her voyage. Alice in Wonderland is also an example of that.
The Godfather would be one of those. I love this. I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to be doing this all day, honestly. I really am. What was the next one? So that was Voyage of Return.
Next one would be comedy.
Yeah.
One with comedies and tragedies is to look at Shakespeare. His plays really fall into a lot of those categories. So Midsummer Night's Dream, obviously a comedy. Twelfth Night, Much Ado About Nothing. And that one's so easy. Rom-coms today always into comedies. They follow that narrative structure to a T.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could throw out a million romantic comedies, but then I would make myself look a little foolish. What would be the next one? What was the other one after comedy?
So that would be tragedies.
Tragedies. Okay. Yeah.
Narrative structure of a tragedy is almost in complete opposition to that of a comedy.
Yeah.
So they're kind of like mirror images of each other.
Yeah. So, and we just got like Romeo and Juliet is the classic tragedy, right?
Yes.
And I'm trying to think of another modern one, but I'll be doing that all day now. With even things my children are watching, I will be categorizing them. And then what was, so how many have we got to now? We got to about 5 or 6. What was the one we haven't discussed?
The final one would be Rebirth. And a really good example of that is Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Ah.
At the end, Scrooge is obviously a very different man to who he was at the beginning.
Love it. That's really interesting. And, even with those categories, you can apply that in any stories in life, right? Whether it's a story in a marketing campaign, in a business setting, in a narrative that you give for a product pitch. Obviously, I'm trying to relate this back to our business. But I would say that the story that and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but just making an assumption that in most business settings, overcoming the monster is the main category, right? There's something we have to beat and defeat here, right? That's the general business storyline you would deploy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like looking at this problem for a customer and seeing how we can aid you in overcoming this challenge.
But I think we need a little bit more rebirth, right? In our business storytelling, or a bit of voyage of return.
I think that would be fun to take a look at something and say, look at everything that's happened so far. How can we recreate ourselves? How can we take what we've learned and come in with something new?
Exactly. Because A, it would be more compelling. B, it would be more differentiating, right? And C, it would probably be better fitting to whatever it is you were doing, rather than just having to slay the beast, as it were, of our competitors. That's awesome. I love that. Thank you, Poppy. That's something that I'm probably going to be thinking about for the next couple of weeks relentlessly. But I think as well, the other thing about stories, and we talked about Shakespeare there, you talked about Dickens, we even talked about Homer's Odyssey, is certain stories are timeless, right? That the certain stories overcome the test of time. And thinking about this, very telling that other things from human nature don't stand the test of time. Or they may resurrect themselves. You know, if you think about fashion or even humor or even art, right? Some of it isn't timeless. Some of it is revisited. It comes back into vogue, as it were. But certain stories are timeless through their adaptability. And you see reincarnations or not reincarnations, but what's the word? They've been modernized or brought into
Reiterations,
yeah, of modern versus old stories. And I think you gave a great example of Dickens and TikTok. There's no such author as Dickens. But I thought that was fascinating. Tell our listeners about that, because we're all trying to embrace new platforms, new ways of telling stories. But I think this really shows some of the timeless features storytelling that can be applied today.
Yeah, well, one aspect of storytelling that's always going to be effective is creating a serial narrative, which is exactly what Dickens did while he was writing. His novels were published chapter by chapter in a weekly issue of a paper. And so if you take a look at his books, his chapters almost always end on a cliffhanger because he needed to maintain his audience and keep them waiting to the next installment. And that is really interesting because when you're watching Instagram Reels or TikToks today, a lot of the story times end with the influencer or whoever they are saying like and follow for part 2. So again, they end their story on a cliffhanger. And I mean, it's a really interesting way of generating an audience for yourself, because if you withhold that information that comes following a cliffhanger, you're going to increase your audience because they realize they have to interact and they have to engage in order to find out what happens next.
Yeah. And again, that notion of the continuation, the serialization of stories, again, starts making me think, again, how that's been applied in business scenarios and business life. And I may be showing my age a bit here, but I remember in the 1980s in the UK, there was, and I think it goes down in history as one of the most effective TV campaigns in British history. But there was Nescafe had a coffee brand called Gold Blend. I think they still have it in the UK. And the TV campaign was this unrequited love affair between this man and this woman. And each TV ad would build on this storyline, right? Each ad would end up with them having a cup of coffee, right? But it built on that storyline for weeks and weeks and weeks. But it was this serialization that didn't really focus too much on the product, but ensured that the viewers were engaged with the storyline as it persisted. So that's what we're saying here, right? Is that Dickens would you say he was I don't know, would he be the creator or originator of such a technique? I'm sure it probably preceded him.
I'm sure it preceded. I don't want to say he was the originator because I believe a lot of novels came out in that format.
Yeah.
Sort of it. But I mean, what's interesting when you talk about that Nescafe ad is that ties into your previous question of what makes certain stories timeless and what makes them work. And I think at the end of the day, it's human emotion. Human emotion isn't something that's going to change. Things are going to come in and out of fashion, and the styles of stories have changed. The medium through which we consume stories has changed. But people still love, they still get angry, they still experience envy. And while all of those elements are the same, stories will be effective for years to come.
It's not the story what you're saying that stays in vogue. It's the emotion that the stories elicit that stay in.
Yeah, exactly. And it's if you can relate to a character, you're going to enjoy the story. You're more likely, rather, to enjoy the story. Mm-hmm. If it's something you've experienced or if it's something you like to daydream about, it's still going to be appealing.
Yeah. Well, no, it's like, I guess if people had seen or read or seen the play, rather, of the original Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, it's difficult for people to relate to the Montagues and the Capulets. It was the Montagues and the Capulets in Verona in the 17th century, right? And so therefore, if you'd go and see the play, it's pretty difficult to relate to those characters. So then several years ago, the Romeo and Juliet movie came out with Leonardo DiCaprio. That was his breakthrough role, right? But what was interesting is they adapted the original screenplay. No, they didn't. The screenplay was exactly the same. The language was exactly the same, but they adapted the modern setting of modern LA with the modern fashions and modern soundtrack, make it more, to your words, relatable to the modern day audience. And it was a total smash, right? It broke Leonardo DiCaprio as an actor. But Baz Luhrmann, he brought that original screenplay, adapted it for a modern, that modern audiences could relate to, and it was a total hit. So that's the timeless nature, right? Timeless stories can continue if they're slightly adapted, but remain that story categorization, that story arc with the emotions that they elicit, right? And we can probably point to a zillion different examples of where that's happened.
Absolutely. I mean, they've just redone a Shakespeare play recently with that Glenn Powell and Sydney Sweeney film, Anyone But You. That's a recreation. I think that one's Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah. And even Great Expectations, 20 years ago with Robert De Niro, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Ethan Hawke. So they took the Dickens concept and it was in Florida and he was an artist. It was a bit ridiculous actually, but it's that adaptability. Anyway, so that's really interesting. And again, I'm going to be thinking when I look at anything today, if there was an originator. So even when you think about, I'm on a roll here. Even when you think about Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story was a modern adaptation of Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was really in keeping because, I mean, what's so great about Shakespeare is you can take his political conflict and put it like in almost any situation for any conflict in any country.
Yeah. Anyway, this is cool. This is great. But those narratives are everywhere, right, Poppy? When we talk, I mean, we've focused on some pretty famous literature, some pretty famous movies, some recreation of plays into modern movies, you know, how that TikTok generation can have serialization of stories. We've even talked about a 1980s coffee ad from the UK, which I thought we'd ever talk about. But those narratives are in every walk of life. It's not constrained to the big screen or a book or your mobile phone. Those stories are ubiquitous, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think we were discussing this earlier, is that everyone is a storyteller. You can't get through life without telling stories. Even when you're telling someone about your day, you're telling a story and you're building a narrative. And you are the protagonist in this story. So life is built up of, so if you have a room of 10 people, you're going to get 10 different stories from whatever happens in that room. And I mean, the trick isn't storytelling, it's how to be a good storyteller, how to look at what's going on around you.
I think there's two aspects in this modern age on the point you just made. I think absolutely humans are born storytellers. And I did some research here that the inherent skills a human must possess to be a good storyteller, but we all have these skills, is charisma, a command of language, narrative skills, adaptability, authenticity, and what was the other one? And humor. They're the characteristics that every human, that if he deploys in an optimum way, can be like a fantastic storyteller. But that doesn't prevent every human possesses those skills to some varying degrees, right? Everybody has a mix of those characteristics that enables them to tell stories. But so that was the first point. And the second point is that storytelling is the most effective form of communication, education, entertainment that humanity has, right? And so therefore, it's an innate skill that we talked about, the skills that humans possess and pass through. But this is the twist. This is something I listened to yesterday, and it got me thinking. In this world of digital abundance, are those skills becoming less necessary? The importance of storytelling becoming less necessary? Is it diminishing, as it were?
Okay, that's an interesting one because so I was watching a video of Margaret Atwood, who obviously wrote The Handmaid's Tale, Oryx and Crake, all of those.
She's from
other
here.
day.
She lives down the road.
Does she actually?
Yeah.
That's so cool. But she was talking about her book, Elias Grace, and doing historical research to be able to write authentically in a historical novel. And she was saying how the best sources of information are diary entries or letters to one another, which is so true. You're not going to find out how people lived by looking at a timeline or by looking at government documents or pieces of information like that. And she was saying how she had to dig, because from letters, you find out how people spoke to one another, how people spoke casually, the verbiage they used, what was important to people back then. And I was thinking about that afterwards, because given the advent of technology, we don't write each other letters anymore. And I don't know anyone who writes things down in a diary. So how are we going to maintain our authentic voice for writers in 100, 200 years to discover?
I listened to the New York Times yesterday and an interview with Dr. Anna Lembke, who writes the books on dopamine addiction in today's. So we're all, like you said there, the communication, you would sit down and you would write a letter. You would record something in your diary. Your main social interaction, particularly in England, was to go to the pub where you would sit with someone and exchange stories about things in your life. It was, that was the central fulcrum of communication. Now we are in a world where people are glued to their digital lives. Everything is on demand, to the point where that connection with other individuals is seen as less necessary. So people could spend a whole day on their device speaking in a digital world to people that aren't necessarily even human. And therefore that human connection of letters, diary entries, pub tales, whatever, starts to become less significant in our lives.
Yeah, it's really interesting as well with how, with these videos and with like the constant I'm sure you've heard of doom scrolling, where you just lose 2 hours. It's really changed how stories are told and how stories begin. You have about 2 or 3 seconds to get someone's attention. If you don't have it, they're going to move on. So a lot of people tell the hook of their story and then start at the beginning. So like, get ready with me as I tell you how a dog bit my hand off. And then they'll be like, so 3 years ago, we bought a puppy. But you've got to get a hook in the first 3 seconds. Otherwise, you've lost people's interest.
Because people today need instant gratification, because they're looking for that dopamine hit quicker. So the dopamine is the chemical that's released when you have some sense of satisfaction in something you're doing. And now with the instantaneous dopamine hits you can get from a world on demand, like you said, you need to get to it quicker. You need to get to that dopamine hit quicker. But what that creates in the long term is a dopamine deficit. So where there's an up, there's a down. And this is potentially what's affecting the mental health epidemic we're in. There's no getting away from it. In the Western world, there's higher suicide rates, depression, and mental health issues than ever before. And a lot of it is being attributed to this this dopamine deficit, because everything is on demand.
And this need for constant mental stimulation.
Exactly. This need for this constant, like I said, instant gratification. And like you said, when it comes to storytelling, precisely to your point, stories, now you need to get to it quickly and you need to give people that hit, that punchline as quickly as possible. And I think if you look at human history, this inflection point we're at right now is probably the most, when it comes to storytelling, the most profound in human history. Do you think?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because there are pros and there are cons, because it's never been easier to share your stories than it is now. There are so many fewer barriers in the way to getting your voice out there, to getting your stories out there. And that, I think, is brilliant. I think having the world being that accessible and having so many platforms, and there are so many self-publishing sites for like more standard novels, and then you have social media to come on and do short little videos. But on the flip side of that, we're now inundated with stories. There are so many, and there are so many more to filter through to find the ones that are actually good. So you're given more opportunities to share, but in doing so, we're almost losing our voice in the crowd.
No, and it's a brilliant point and goes back to several of the conversations we've had in this season. You know, the creator generation of YouTube, you know, there's now, and I'm going to get this statistic right, Larissa, for the first time. If the YouTube generation creates 300 million hours of content in a year, and YouTube is the most watched platform, not just on mobile or computer, but on television. So by that analogy, if 0.01% of that user-generated content became comparable with Hollywood through the use of AI and digital techniques, that would double Hollywood's annual output of content. So to your point, yeah, these new tools and digital mechanisms allow people to have a voice. It democratizes the distribution of stories around the world. But again, what we're discussing here is what is the negative, you know, what's the downside of that, right? What could be the downside of that? If there is one.
Well, I mean, it's kind of because everyone can be a storyteller. Everyone's trying to be a storyteller. So it's harder to make yourself stand out, and it's harder to differentiate yourself.
Yeah.
And it's also, I mean, I'm speaking from my own research kind of into the publishing world. Now, if you want to get published through traditional means, you have to first submit a draft, a cover letter and everything to an agent. If you get taken on by an agent, they then have to send your work out to find you an editor. If you get taken on by an editor, so it's this involved multi-step process. You can't reach out to a publishing company anymore and see if they're interested. You have to start several more steps further down the ladder, which I think is why so many people have turned to just releasing their content on
the internet
or on TikTok. If you go viral, that's the key now. Once you're viral, you're pretty much sorted.
But is that because they're trying to retain the status quo? Or is it because they feel they need to filter more?
I think it's to filter more, because can you imagine if there was one publishing company and they were just getting everything that was happening? And there are more people in the world now, and there are more people who want to be writers, want to be storytellers now. You've got to have some process of making sure what the publishing companies receive is a quality product.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, and that leads us really nicely into AI, generative AI. So like you said, everybody wants to be a writer now. Generative AI is probably the most impactful tool ever created in technology that could enable aspirational authors to realize their dreams. What are your thoughts on this generative? I mean, it's only 3 years in. Were you still studying when OpenAI released ChatGPT?
No, I graduated. No.
Give me your thoughts on it. Can it replace us? Is it good? What's your overall?
I stand by that. I think at the moment, the relationship between humans and AI is largely symbiotic, because we can use AI to improve our writing. But I mean, you can't just go to AI and say, write a story and have it give you the exact thing that's in your brain. It will write a story, but there's no guarantee it's what you want. So I think a new skill that's going to have to emerge is people who are good at using AI. I have read something from someone who had just plugged in all this information. This wasn't a fictional piece, it was a non-fictional document. Plugged it into AI, copy-pasted it into Word and sent it over. And I've never read anything quite so awful in my life. It was really poor. It just didn't fit. The tone wasn't right. The verbiage wasn't right. None of it fit what the task in hand was. So I think if you're going to use AI, you have to have your own clear idea of what you want it to look like. And at the end of the day, it might just be easier to go in and write some pieces yourself.
No,
AI
yeah.
all the way.
No, and earlier on in the conversation, I listed off what I believe are the characteristics of a good storyteller, right? And I think if you go through each of those characteristics, start with charisma, right? It's pretty clear. Generative AI as a language prediction model has no charisma, all right? Command of language, yeah, it has the best command of language more than humans. In fact, it has the command of every single language on the planet, right? So then you go, okay, 1-1, right? And then you can go to humor, right? You could go to ChatGPT and ask you to tell it, it can tell you a joke, but it's a joke, it's read somewhere else, it's out of context. A sense of human humor needs precisely that, a sense, right?
I mean, it's not going to be able to do intonation. It's not going to be able to do sarcasm, implication, any of that stuff.
Impersonation, exactly.
Yeah.
So you can, and then, you could go through authenticity as one of those other characteristics. There's no authenticity in an AI created story, right? The ability to write a narrative, yeah, it can do that. So what my point is, you can go through those characteristics we discussed earlier and then look at it and say, well, it doesn't at this moment in time possess all of those characteristics that make a great storyteller, right? So it becomes, but it's still very early days, right? It's still only 2 or 3 years in its development, and it will evolve and continue to persist. So if we look at that evolution of storytelling moving forward now, and we talked about, the origins of stories, the importance of stories, the characteristics of a good story. And then we got to modern day and talked about, how the adaptability of stories, how we bring back old stories, how it's so important, how narratives are everywhere. But from this moment forward, what is the evolution of storytelling from your future-looking perspective, Poppy?
Well, stories are never going to go away. Like you said, stories are a part of human nature. We're never going to be able to not tell stories. And then I think books are going to come back. I think physical books are going to come back in a sort of vintage way, but also there's this element of ownership that's really appealing. And I think that is because the digital world is becoming so fleeting. There's almost this increased pleasure from actually owning something you can hold in your hands. I know lots of people who have Kindles and they buy books. I used to have a Kindle and I stopped using it because I like holding a book in my hand. And all these people, my mum's an example. My mum listens to audiobooks on Kindle. And if she really likes the book, she will order it. So she has a physical copy to put on her bookshelf and she'll read it later. So yeah. I think longer narratives might also come back. And I think as people become more aware of our limited attention span and ways in which social media is detrimental to our mental health, I think there's going to be a piqued interest in kind of longer narratives and books and people trying to go back to that.
I like it.
Yeah. I mean, this might just be optimistic and hopeful thinking on my part, but a lot more people are reading. And this is a really interesting thing that TikTok does, because you get like a sort of community going around a certain book series. And then you are really into this book. You go into your TikTok, your For You page is full of people who also love this book. It's like this little digital community. And if you see that, and then
it's the shared experience, right? So yeah. I love this notion of if books go back to their original manifestation, the digital element then can provide the community to discuss those shared experiences.
Exactly. As people are talking about it, that's almost what's marketing the book at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Now, and when you were talking about that, it made me think of something. And it's an interesting story. One of the first things to be digitalized in the entertainment world was our music, right? And I used to have, I don't know if you remember records, Poppy. cassettes. Okay. And even CDs, right? I used to have lots of records, CDs. And then I digitalized my music connection and I gave away all those physical pieces of my music. I literally gave them away. I took it into a big box in the office I was working and said to everybody, help yourselves to like 30 years worth of music that I'd collected. But for me, it was like, you know, now there's been a resurrection of vinyl, right? People yearn vinyl, original records to play. And they love to have that physical memento of that piece of art. So when you look at it, the book analogy you use, I can totally see it. Because if you look just over here, you see my bookshelf, right? Where I keep all my favorite books from university and beyond, even though they're easily digitalized and accessible, they're there as a, what's the word? A decoration, a piece of art in my study. So that's your prediction, is that those physical books can come back and people will be proud. Not proud, but there's a sense of ownership with it being more physical.
Yeah, exactly. And it feels like, and I mean, I don't know if this is true, but in a way, almost the novelty of digitalization has sort of worn off a bit. Where, I mean, like you say, with digitalizing music, it's like, this is amazing. I can clear up all of the space. I don't need it. I can have all of my music right here. With Kindle, I can have all of my books right here. And then now that the novelty's worn off, it's like, no, but I quite like looking at my bookshelf and looking through the titles and being able to pull one down and have it on my lap.
Yeah. My children will come in and look at the books on my bookshelf, and there's an inquisition, there's a curiosity of why I have those certain books, and can I have a look at this? They're not going to go through my tablet and scroll through my book collection, you know.
No. The
But
physicality of stories and reading is quite a nice feeling.
And even the notion of a library, you know, going into a physical building where there's books and stories and knowledge is timeless. Surely we're not going to, you know, just rely on... And there's a community. There's people, even though you're not supposed to talk in a library, there's community, there's people in there, and you're looking at what they're reading or what they're looking for.
So I don't know if you've heard of this, but the Future Library of Norway, they started this back in 2014. It's really cool. And they planted 1,000 trees just outside of Norway. And for the next 100 years, so they'll stop 2114, they're asking one author a year to write something, a book, a short story, a poem that no one else has seen. And they keep it sealed away. And at the end of 100 years, they're going to cut down these trees and use the wood to make paper to publish all of these previously unseen stories and then create this new library. And I think that's really cool.
So that's Poppy Hollingworth prediction. You have it here. Books are going to make a comeback.
I have hope.
No, I think it's great. I love it. I love it. Really, I do. And even, now you've even got me thinking, even when you get on a plane, there's somebody sat next to you, you look at what they're reading, right? And if it's something you're familiar with or you may have read, it initiates a conversation and a connection.
Yes, exactly.
The digital form of literature and stories removes that connection, removes that connection between human beings because it's anonymous, and it's as much digital connection is, it is anonymized, and it separates you from other human beings, and that could be a reason why it makes, I wouldn't say a comeback, but people value that medium again.
And it's so exciting to find someone who loves the same books as you do.
Yeah.
Because you get into all of the details and all of the theories.
Yeah, it is. And again, that shared experience where you've, even with any stories or movies, it's been able to discuss that with some, I mean, that's what English literature at school was all about. You read a book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and then you spent the next 6 months dissecting it with your teacher and your classmates, right? That's effectively what it is. And yeah, I think it's great. Right. So, Poppy, are you ready? I want to hear your story now. So this is the segment of the show where I'm going to hand over to you. I think our conversation has been incredible, really. I've enjoyed every moment of it. But now I'm going to hand over to you to recount a story that's had a profound impact on you and your life. And again, as I remind all our guests, that story could have been a movie, a book, a TV ad, a TikTok, an Instagram reel, something your grandfather told you when you were a young lady, or whatever it is. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Poppy. This is TGI Storytime. TGI Storytime.
So when I was really little, my granny used to write little stories just about things that happened. An owl once fell down her chimney, and she wrote a little story about how the owl got to the chimney and how it fell down. And we were living in Dallas at the time. We had 2 cats, and I was young. I must have been about 5 or 6. And they were indoor cats, but one of them ran away. His name was Syrinx. And he ran away, and he was gone for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then eventually just kind of sauntered back in. He was a Siamese cat. It was all in his attitude. And my granny wrote a story about what Syrinx got up to on those kind of couple of days where he was missing. And she had a friend who was an illustrator. And so she collaborated with him, and he drew some images, and then she got it printed not as a proper book, but it was kind of like a pamphlet, and it was called The Cat. And it was set up with, I don't think it had chapters, but it had all these illustrations. And she gave a copy to everyone in the family. And I had never seen myself in a book before. There was a little illustration of me at the end hugging the cat when he came back home. And when I tell you, I have never felt so famous in my entire life.
Until this podcast.
And until this podcast. So, I'm going places now. But this was the most incredible thing that had ever happened to me. Anyone who came over to the house had to come up and see my copy of the book. And I'm like, flip to the end, there's a surprise. And there I am. But it was the first time that I kind of realized that stories, it's more than just the Magic Treehouse books. It's more than just Judy Blume. We can be in stories as well. And there are so many stories happening around us. And I mean, I don't think that was when I was like, I want to be a creative writer, I want to be a storyteller. But that definitely influenced it, where it's like, one day I'm going to write something, and people in my life are going to be in it, and they're going to look at it, and they're going to feel famous too. And it was just this really impactful and exciting thing for me as a little child to be a book character as well as just myself.
It's a great story. By the way, do you still have it?
I do still have it.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Do you have it there? Do you have it there?
Not with me, no. It's at my parents' house.
Okay.
But
right.
Yeah.
Anyway, but look, I think something that I think is something we've uncovered, or maybe we haven't uncovered, maybe it's always existed. If the characters in a story are people care about, love, or in this instance, even yourself, then the story has a more profound impact on you. And I think that sounds obvious, right? But the story becomes more memorable, resonates with you. And, if you're in it, not just out of vanity, but it's there, you're a protagonist in this story. And I think what is it they say? Most storytellers, if they write a story, or that the first book they ever write is about themselves.
I've written things over the years, and my family members will read it and they'll go, oh, well, that's Grandad. Like, that's your mum. You take so much inspiration from the people around you. I think anyone who can see you and then also possibly see parts of themselves.
No, exactly. Again, it comes to that authenticity. Like generative AI's characters will be based on something that was written by somebody else in some other place. But your characters will be based on lived-in experiences of people you knew intimately, and also, your observation of their uniqueness and their idiosyncrasies is something that only you can identify. It's what makes it authentic and original to you.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what did the cat do?
Well, he swam from the neighbor's swimming pool, I think he fell off a fence at one point. I also remember being slightly suspicious when I first read this or had it read to me, because it's a bit like, well, how do you know? Were you there? But I remember the pool, he had a run-in with the neighbor's dog as well. And then I think the way it ended was he just decided he'd had enough and he would come home now, which did very much fit the vibe of this cat.
Yeah. Oh. No, and did you find that you felt a closer connection with your grandmother based on this as well?
My granny and I have always been really close. I think it just made sense to me, to be honest, because she wrote about all these other things that I was just like, well, I may as well be in one of them. This is great. This was the only one that was illustrated, though.
I think I probably phrased my question incorrect. Of course, you were close with your grandmother, but did you find that the fact that she could write this story and you would be so enthralled in it, that's the uniqueness in the human storytelling connection, right? For example, every evening I read to my children. I read them Enid Blyton, books that I was familiar with when I was a child, but that human storytelling medium is irreplaceable.
No, yes, I see what you mean. Like having that connection through the story and being written about by someone. It's like that quote where it's like, if a poet loves you, you'll never die.
Ah, I love that.
You through their writing.
I think that's the title of this episode, Larissa. If the poet loves you, you'll never die. I love that. That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing your story with us. That's fantastic, Poppy. Now we're going to get into some real questions. This is TGI to go. I think you know what this one's all about. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
TGI to go. Question number 1. Sunrise or sunset?
I would say sunrise. I really like getting up early and getting things done. So I feel a lot more productive at 7 a.m. than I do at 7 p.m.
And that's novel because you're Generation Z, right?
Yeah. As you know, I'm a big fan of being in bed at 8:30 at the moment. Did that last night. Very boring.
Me too as well. With a good book, though, I hasten to add.
Yes, same.
Let's get into music. I've changed this a little bit. Drake or The Weeknd?
Oh, God. Is neither an option?
If you had to listen to one of them, I can change it again.
If I had to listen to one of them, I'd probably do The Weeknd, but his earlier songs.
Okay. Have you listened to the new album that came out on Friday?
No, I have not. I liked him a lot in kind of 2016.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. Because my daughter is coming up to 15. And we talk about generational demographic cohorts. We talk about timeless stories and things. She came to me on Friday night whilst I was cooking dinner and listening to the new Weeknd album. And she said, my Snap is blowing up about the Weeknd album. Can we go and see him in concert? It's awesome. And I thought, oh my gosh, talk about crossing demographic lines here. Anyway, that was interesting. So you would choose The Weeknd. That's good. Next question. Bubble tea or cold brewed coffee?
Ooh. I feel like it would be cold brew coffee, except for like once every 6 months when a bubble tea would just sound really nice. But 9 times out of 10, cold brew coffee.
You're British originally. Your family is British. Do you drink Yorkshire tea?
I do sometimes. My fiance loves Yorkshire tea, and he's Australian. So, that's his go-to.
Yorkshire tea? Wow. As a Brit, I don't drink tea at all, which is weird.
Do you not?
No. Very strange. Very strange.
And
now, you could go on vacation tomorrow. I'm going to give you 2 choices of airline tickets. Puerto Rico or the Bahamas?
Probably Puerto Rico, because I feel like, I don't know, that sounds quite interesting to me. I'm not really a beach person. And I feel like the Bahamas is much more of a beachy vibe. So probably Puerto Rico, which also has beaches, but there might be other things I can do as well.
I think there's probably more cultural things in Puerto Rico than Bahamas.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay. Now you could watch a movie this evening. Would you I'm going to add another question to this as well, just because I thought of something. The Matrix or Back to the Future?
Back to the Future. I love 80s vibes, 80s music, 80s films. Big fan.
You're a big 80s fan.
Yes, I am.
Who's your favourite band from the 80s?
Favorite band from the 80s? Okay, so they're kind of 70s into 80s, but I love Meatloaf.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
I think that's one of the best albums I've listened to.
Oh, really? I thought you were going to say something very British, like the Pet Shop Boys or the Human League. Or...
I do like the Pet Shop Boys as well, but I really love Meatloaf. I don't know why.
That's cool. No, that's cool. And our final question today, and we're going to bring it all the way back round. Charles Dickens or Jane Austen?
Jane Austen. Jane Austen, just, I know, I have a space in my heart for Jane Austen. I love, her books are really comforting because I feel like they're basically just a gossip session.
Yeah.
And reading it is just like chatting with a friend.
No, you talk about timelessness, and my wife, my mother are just, they would read or watch an adaptation of Jane Austen over anything, over absolutely anything. And I think that when we talk about timeless storytelling, I think that is probably one of the most fitting examples.
Yeah. What I love about Jane Austen as well is she has humor in her books that still translates to today. There are bits of Pride and Prejudice with Mrs. Bennet that make me laugh.
Yeah. No, exactly. And, I have 3 daughters, and Mr. Bennet was this gentleman surrounded by all these daughters and was this sort of different voice from Mrs. Bennet, right? Much calmer, much more in tune. And I always used to consider myself that kind of character, which again is timeless, right? In fact, where I used to live in England, I would literally drive about 2 miles down the road and I'd cross a bridge over the river, which meant I was entering Hampshire. And it would say, you're now entering Austen country, the birthplace of Jane Austen. And then you could go down to where her house was as it was when she was writing. So you can see her desk, and it's a beautiful English village on your way down to the south coast in Hampshire, near Alton. It's actually Alton, which is near Basingstoke. So you get it. You get it there. Anyway, you can go there and you can see everything, and it's quite a historical site. Okay, so there we go, Poppy. I think that was a brilliant Sunday morning conversation. I really appreciate it. I think we went into some great places, and I've learned a lot that's going to challenge me all day and make me think. Is there anything you'd like to impart upon our listeners before we sign off today?
No, nothing. Just keep telling stories. Don't ever stop sharing your stories with everyone.
Exactly. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Poppy. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely Sunday.
So there we go. That's a wrap for this episode of The Great Indoors. Of course, we'll be back next week. But thank you, Poppy. It was wonderful to have you on the show. It was a great conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I will be maybe perusing some old books and literature on my bookshelf this weekend as we speak. Now, where do we go from here? Well, look, for more updates on this season and all things The Great Indoors from the start of written time, visit us at amdocs.com/The Great Indoors for everything. All our content, back episodes, videos, you name it. But thank you for listening. We'll see you next time as we continue exploring the human side of the digital age. I'm Matthew Roberts from Amdocs in Toronto. Have a great day wherever you are. See you next time.